right, we're going to dive into each part in the coming section. So 8.2, we're looking at the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. To understand this, we have to understand how plants absorb energy from sunlight. We'll talk a little bit about the properties of light, kind of important to know about, and then we will describe how and where photosynthesis is taking place. So it's all about the sun and the energy that's coming from it here and how we're going to capture it. So light energy. Light moves as a wave. And this wave has what we call a wavelength. That's the difference from one peak to another. The shorter this wavelength, the higher energy contained within that light. So this is the difference in wavelengths, what gives us different colors and different types of electromagnetic radiation. So we have everything from radio waves all the way down to things like visible light, ultraviolet, things like that. So confusingly, if you go on to take quantum physics and stuff like that, light also moves as a particle, which is a bit weird. So the electromagnetic spectrum, as we call it, is everywhere. It's all around us. Like I said, we have real long wavelengths, things that are meters long, 30, 40 meters long in wavelength, all the way down to visible light. Above visible light, we have that thing called infrared. You can feel that as heat, but it is electromagnetic radiation. A small portion is visible light. We call it visible light because that's what our eyes can detect. We're very selfish, so there are other organisms that can detect other parts. There are things like bees that can see into the UV. If you ever see a picture of a plant under a UV camera, it's very cool. They have different patternings to signal to bees. So our eyes can see everything from long wavelength red, orange, yellow, green, getting shorter and shorter down to blue, indigo, and violet at the high end of the energy spectrum. The wavelength is getting shorter and shorter. We get into UV and then X-rays. And as you know, these things can be damaging to our DNA. That's why we have sunscreen, to avoid too much UV. These are higher energy radiations, everything down to gamma rays. Okay. Gamma rays won't turn you into the Incredible Hulk. They will kill you generally by damaging your DNA, destroying your cells, potentially giving you cancer as well. So sorry, Marvel fans, it doesn't quite work that way. But we're going to talk about visible light and plant pigments, because plant pigments can absorb certain wavelengths of light. So we're going to talk about absorbing, but we also have to talk about reflecting or transmitting. So we have something like chlorophyll, a plant pigment. Which color or wavelengths of light do you think that absorbs? Go ahead and pause the video. Think about that for a second. Okay, I'm not going to tell you quite yet, but when it comes time for fall, although fall is rather short here, we do see a broad range of colors out there. Everything from greens that we expect to reds and yellows and oranges and things like that. So what are they absorbing? Okay, I'm going to bet many of you thought that it might be green for chlorophyll. That is a common mistake. It's okay. We're going to learn about the difference between absorbing and reflecting. So chlorophyll actually reflects green light. That's why we can see it. And it absorbs other wavelengths of light. So don't put your plants under green light. It will kill them if they don't have the other wavelengths that they need. So there's actually several different pigments in there. We're going to talk about chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and these things called carotenoids. They have different absorption spectrums. So if we look here, we can see where they're absorbing types of light and where they're not. And primarily the greens and into this yellow range here, they're not absorbing any of that light energy. So chlorophyll A, let's find that here, that absorbs in the red wavelengths. And then we come over the solid line down into the purple indigo-y wavelengths as well. Chlorophyll B has a slightly shifted spectrum. Chlorophyll B is the dashed line here, so that absorbs some of those oranges and then down into the blue spectrum. Now that's interesting. Why have two different chlorophylls? Well, we'll talk about that in a sec. And then there's this pigment called carotenoids. their purpose is different. This is to absorb sunlight energy. But as we said, there's a lot of extra energy in light. There's a lot of light energy that we don't need for this. So carotenoids can help dissipate excess light energy. They also have been co-opted into many of our fruits that we see. Fruits often have bright colors to signal their animal dispersers. So they're like waving at them like, hey, come bring my seeds somewhere else. So carotenoids tend to absorb in the blue and the purplish range, but they reflect almost all these other ones. So reds, oranges, yellows, greens. Think about fruit colors. We tend to see those colors in fruits there. Okay, so why do leaves look green? Well, that's because none of them are absorbing these wavelengths. They're bouncing off and coming to our eyes. That's how we see things, with light bouncing off. But back to that question, why do we have two different types of chlorophylls? And you can see they're pretty close in structure. Carotenoids are a little bit different, but why have different pigments evolved, and why do they have slightly different spectra? Well, plants have to deal with different qualities of light. Throughout the year, the light quality changes, its composition in terms of wavelength changes, but also, if you're a plant, you don't really get to choose where you live. You land as a seed and you hope for the best, right? So if you're living at the bottom of the forest, you're getting different qualities of light that are coming in than if you're a big tree at the top, right? So having this wide absorption spectra, those different pigments, is very useful for this, for the different qualities of light. Now in fall, we see the different pigments coming out because the plant pigments break down at different rates. So like evergreen trees, many of our conifers and things like that, they have chlorophyll that sticks around. But in other ones, they kind of go dormant in the winter because the light quality is lower. And we start to see the chlorophyll break down first, and then we see those carotenoids mainly showing their presence here, reflecting the oranges and the reds and the yellows that are in there. Okay, we have to go back to chemistry a little bit. Light energy can excite electrons. So we talked about electrons and their orbitals. They have different energy states. Photons can excite electrons. They can cause them to jump up to a higher energy state. So this is part of how we're harvesting that light energy. A photon, a particle of light, comes in, hits an electron, transfers its energy to it, and it jumps up to a higher level. We're then going to need to capture that energy as the electron falls back down to its normal ground state, as we call it. To do that, that's where chlorophyll comes in. And chlorophyll functions in two what we call photosystems. The photosystems have two jobs. The chlorophyll is capturing the light energy, but then it's used to do two different things. So the first photosystem is actually called Photosystem 2. I apologize, that's the one that was discovered second. It happens to be first in the pathway. Sorry, scientific discoveries don't always happen in linear order, unfortunately. So Photosystem 2 is first. You can see we're starting down here at a low energy state. And we have a photon that comes in and hits our photosystem and excites an electron in chlorophyll, jumping it up to a higher energy state. In the process, we're going to take water and we're going to split water in half. Okay, that's going to produce oxygen, but we're also going to get hydrogen ions in the process. These hydrogen ions are going to be critical in a moment. The electron at a high state goes through an electron transport system. We've seen this before in mitochondria. It's very similar in chloroplasts. The electrons get pulled through and they pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. Then that electron comes to photosystem 1, which is second, and another photon comes in and excites it in a chlorophyll molecule. We have another electron transport system, and here that high energy electron produces NADPH, a high energy electron carrier, which will be utilized later. The hydrogen gradient that we built here will flow through ATP synthase, very similar to mitochondrial ATP synthase, and ATP will be generated. Okay, so all we're doing is taking water, breaking it apart, pumping some hydrogens, and making NADPH. Okay, the hydrogens are making ATP. Let's look a little bit deeper at this. So the photosystems are in the thylakoid membrane, and the pigment molecules are embedded in the photosystem. So here's photosystem 2, and it uses light energy basically to break apart water. And we get electrons from that, we get hydrogen ions, and our waste product, oxygen, out of that.
One quick addendum here. This process where we're breaking water into the electrons and the oxygen here, this is called photolysis, or basically light breaking. So we're using light energy to break apart the water there. It's going to provide the electrons and what generates our oxygen waste there.
So photosystem 1 is also harvesting light energy and transferring it to chlorophyll A here and re-energizing that electron. So photosystem 2 is taking that light energy, breaking the water, creating hydrogen ions and oxygen, but it's also powering pumps in that electron transport chain that are pumping hydrogen ions, in this case, into the thylakoid space. We have a high concentration of hydrogen ions or protons here. So photosystem 2 pumps, then light energy hits the photosystem 1, and that's where we capture our high energy electron, making NADPH. In the final part, we let the hydrogen ions flow through ATP synthase, generating ATP. These two products, ATP and NADPH, are going to move on to the light-independent reactions. Let's watch an animation of this. Very cool animation there. It's always amazing to see that process in what we think happens in real time. So let's review before we finish this section. What would happen if you grew your houseplants in pure green light? Go and pause the video, think about that. Well, the short answer is they probably would die if you did it long enough. For a little bit of time, they'd have enough stored energy probably to continue on, but they would not be able to continue photosynthesis. They would not absorb enough light energy to keep those photosystems working because chlorophyll does not absorb green light. So they'd be unable to continue photosynthesis. Okay, we talked about light. Light waves have energy. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy in there. Plant pigments absorb light energy in the visible range. We have chlorophyll and carotenoids. They're our main plant pigments, and they have specific what we call absorption spectrums. Light energy that comes in there can excite the electrons in these pigment molecules. The light energy is first harvested by Photosystem 1, which pumps hydrogen ions. It splits apart water to do that. And then producing oxygen as a waste product. Photosystem 1, the second one, generates NADPH. That hydrogen ion gradient that we created turns ATP synthase, generating ATP, which will be utilized in the next section.